Welcome everybody, and nice to see some familiar faces again. This is our second webinar on federal procurement best practices, and we're going to continue presenting these monthly, as Kathy and Michelle mentioned earlier. Next slide. So let's just kind of get into this. I know many of you, I mean, as grantees, as subrecipients even, have been wrestling with this procurement question. And really, EPA and other federal agencies have specific procurement standards, but really the bottom line is really about ensuring that you're getting value for your grant dollars, that there's a certain cost effectiveness, that it's an open competition, that there's a complete transparency in how anyone is selected. Through these grants, and that there's good faith efforts to not only support sustainability and social responsibility, but also to secure any kind of disadvantaged business enterprises. So just kind of keep all of that in mind as you're going through your procurement process. So next slide. So I'm just going to talk about, basically there's three different types of procurement methods. There's the micro purchase, there's the simplified acquisition, and then there's formal competitive requirements, and then there's two different types of those. But I'll kind of drill down into each of them separately. But just know that I would say that the numbers to remember, like 50K and under, micro purchase, 250K, but above 50K, simplified acquisition, and then above 250, it's really, you're talking about formal competition. So we'll go into these in more detail. Next slide, please. So on the micro purchase, this is the one where you don't actually have to have any formal competition. So this is really intended for really what they say, minor purchases. You can do this without EPA approval, things like supplies, or maybe it's a certain type of vendor, that is kind of providing, a commercially available service. And the idea is that because these are minor purchases, that you also do need to make an effort to make sure that when you do purchase these items, especially if you do it several times, more than once, that you're kind of equitably distributing your purchases, because you're not kind of going through some kind of formal search process. And then obviously, the disadvantaged business enterprises, it's always that effort to meet that. There is an ability to do micro purchase, but you need EPA approval. And obviously at these days, it seems like EPA approval is hard to get. So we're going to suggest other things if that situation comes into play. So the next slide. And our next type of method is simplified acquisition. This is between 50 and 250K. And this, a lot of times people call this informal bid. That might be what your organization calls it. And it's really, you just get at least three quotes, three prices from sources. You don't do any formal advertising. You might have an email list where you go out and you just, or you might have specific vendors that you might go out to. But just the idea is that you do a little price shopping, like if, you were doing this for your own home, and you had to do some type of construction project or something, you just get those three quotes so that you have some basis of comparison. And then generally here, you do have some flexibility. You don't always have to select the lowest price, but you should have a justification, a reasoning behind why you would go with someone who was a higher price vendor. And then you would share that with your project officer. Next slide. So here we're going to go into kind of, these are just kind of all the formal competition requirements in general. This is going above the 250K. Here you are casting a wider net, and so I do, you want to make sure you're getting a good response. You have the ability, you could advertise this on your website, you could go to your bidder list, your email list, you could you could go into Planet Bids. You can do a number of things that, but the idea is that you're kind of trying to really solicit a certain number of responses. And then just caveat here about, tribal and local governments, can use their own written procurement policies. That's a little set aside. And then in general, you want this to be open for 30 days. So next slide. And so there's two different types of formal competition. The first one I'm going to go into is a little less complicated, and that is the sealed bids. So this is when you can precisely specify what you want. Let's say, I don't know, let's say you're looking for low-cost sensors. You know exactly what you're looking for, you know, what they need to measure, et cetera, et cetera. You know, this could be for certain types of construction activities. It could be for equipment. It could be for bulk supplies. But the, basically that you're going to get basically a bid and you'll be able to compare, but everyone is working off the same playing field. So everyone has the same kind of specifications, you know, performance or technical specifications that they're competing on. And so, and then the other thing here, same as with simplified acquisition, is that if it isn't awarded to the lowest bidder, and this is sealed bids is really kind of sort of within meeting the qualifications, the technical specifications, it is a lot more driven by price. Then you do need to get that EPA approval. So then the next slide, and that brings us to the most maybe complicated type of competition. These are proposals, you know, what they call requests for proposals, RFPs. Now, the reason why you would do this versus the sealed bids is if you have a more kind of complex request that you're trying to procure, a service that you're trying to procure for. It's not just give me, you know, these are the technical specifications, but you want more details from your contractors, your potential contractors. You want to have a schedule. You want to have a scope of work. You want to know what their prior experience is. You want to know about their team qualifications. You are basically literally asking for a proposal because you know, this is a big job and there are a lot of considerations in play. And so you are requesting more information. There's a higher level of complexity. So in this case, you know, you do need to make sure in the RFP that you have clearly defined selection criteria, and that they can be weighted by percentage, by points, but it could be prior experience, it could be team qualifications, it could be understanding of the scope of work. You know, usually about 65, 70% is on these kind of technical types of specifications, and then usually 30 to 35% is on cost. So it's kind of weighing the qualifications versus the cost to come up with what your selection criteria is. Has to be in the RFP. You know, it's very clear, you know, what the priority is. And then you have to have that kind of selection method documented. So, you know, typically you would have a review committee. It could be comprised of internal and external people. Generally on that review committee, you're going to have some broad expertise on all aspects of the work that you're going out for RFP for. So you might have someone who's good at finance, you might have someone who's good on the technical side, but you want to make sure you cover all your bases so that collectively with your review committee, you can determine who the most qualified contractors would be. So this is extremely important. You know, you would have scoring, everybody in the review committee scores, and you know, and you basically come together, you discuss it, and you come up with a rationale as to who you're going to go with and why on the basis of points, and really having a kind of a collaborative discussion on that. So I just wanted to emphasize how important all of that is. This is also something you're going to share with EPA, what your scoring is, you know, what the rationale is, all of that. It's really, really important that all your procurements really be compliant and above board. And then I just on architecture and engineering firms, there it's a little bit different than others. You can do more of a qualification based kind of competitive selection because they have, you know, special qualifications, obviously. So next slide. So here I just wanted to kind of talk about things that aren't allowed. So I think two really, really big overarching things: conflict of interest and anything that restricts competition. Those are the big things. And there's different kinds of conflict of interest. You know, there's personal, there's organizational. And I do want to stress on the conflict of interest. It's not just the actual conflict of interest, it's even the appearance of conflict of interest. So that it just cannot be overly emphasized how important that is. So, to really steer clear of that, and to really look ahead and make sure, you don't have someone on the review committee, you don't have someone who's bidding, you don't have anyone who is any sort of unfair advantage or conflict of interest. And then this is kind of brings me to the next point, which was about restricting competition. So obviously, in even just developing the RFP, you can't obviously have anyone who's going to bid be part of that, have any inside information. You also have to just make sure that all your selection criteria are reasonable. So, you can't impose a requirement that someone, has to come into the office every day to do this work if that isn't actually necessary. So, you just have to be kind of mindful of that in terms of making sure that you are kind of casting that net wide, that you are not trying to favor any company, even if it's a contractor you've done business with many times before, on EPA grants, it just has to be a level playing field. So next slide. So here, just kind of want to sort of review these best practices. So, if you're following the guidance, you don't need EPA approval. If you are literally following the process that we've kind of discussed in this PowerPoint, no problem. There are times when you do need approval from your PO, you need to touch. And actually, what I do say is that even if you don't need approval of something, always touch base with your PO. Always let them know what's going on. Hey, we release this RFP. You can share the RFP with them. That you can invite them to comment. They are a resource. Even if they can't respond to you, at least they are aware of what's going on with your project. You are doing your part, your due diligence and communication. It's part of your compliance. So that's really, really important. But in terms of things where you might need approval, again, micro purchases exceeding over 50K, but I would say just do simplified acquisition if it's under 250K. Otherwise, you're going to just have to do formal competition. And then in situations where you are not choosing the lowest price vendor or service, really provide that rationale. So there might be some overarching reason why you need to go with a certain company. And that's fine, but you need to present that to your project officer. And again, here it's all about transparency and communication, really sharing the details. So if you are maybe even struggling with, how you should structure that RFP, whether you should do one RFP, multiple RFPs, you can feel free to share those details with your PO. If, you're not getting any feedback from them, you can also reach out to us. We at TRC, we look at those RFPs. We're happy to advise and to kind of flag things that, well, no, this is not actually a reasonable selection criteria, or no, you need to include the BABA, Davis-Bacon, DBRA requirements, whatever it might be. And so again, especially on the construction side, really, really important to include those clauses so that whoever is bidding on this is well aware of what these requirements are, and that this is a federal grant that's paying for this. And there's going to be a little bit more at play here, that they're not going to just do the job, give you an invoice and go, that they actually have to comply with certain requirements. And this might actually even be on top of kind of local or state requirements for construction or public works requirements projects. So sometimes there's a lot to impact. And, if you have a question about that, again, we're also happy to walk you through that and talk about all those things just to make sure that you are in your RFP, in your procurement, that you're flowing down all those requirements. So next slide. And so here I'm just going to present a scenario. This one is basically to design and build a 15,000 square foot LEED Gold certified community center. This is not an atypical project, with charging station and a battery electric shuttle bus. So here, you have work for the design, you have the work for the contract, the construction contract. You can see that both of these amounts are over 250K. So you're going to have to go through a competitive bid. And then, just some kind of background facts about, that the RFP was issued on March 1st and that you did interact with a VP of a company planning to bid. So let's go into the next slide. So what what procurement method should be used? It is a competitive bid. So, but you do have some options here for the design contract versus the construction contract. And again, here it just depends on the level of complexity of things and what you feel comfortable in, if the level of detail that you need. And then in terms of whether or not that selected design firm can provide templates for the construction contract, yes, they can if the firm is not bidding on the construction contract. And then um, the the RFP does need to be open for 30 days. That is so, so, so important. You have to open it. There's no negotiations on competitive bid. Have to open that solicitation for at least 30 days. Could be longer, but 30 days is usually sufficient. And then if you think about other requirements in this particular example that would be useful, obviously, since this is a LEED gold certified project, experience with that is important. Experience of EV charging is important. And with design of community centers as public buildings, there's, kind of certain requirements attached to that. So let's go to the next slide. So this, right now, I mean, up until this point, I've basically been talking about what federal procurement looks like in a normal situation. Now we're going to maybe try to unpack what it might be in this current climate. So, if you have some options in terms of how you do your procurements, it is true that simplified acquisition, the informal bid, is quicker if you have that ability to keep certain contracts under 250 rather than just doing one big contract. It depends, on the project. That is something you should consider. The other thing, if you are going out to bid, especially, with the RFP, with the full proposals, one thing you really want to look at is their administrative and their, basically their organizational capacity. Are they going to be capable of efficiently, implementing this project? Are they going to be able to go into contract? Are they going to be able to do prompt billing? Are they going to have those really administrative resources to collect invoices, to do the prevailing wage documentation, to literally, doing a federal grant funded project is a lot more complicated than typical projects. So you have to really consider that organizational capacity. And then the other thing you might also consider is trying to do things that are simpler, such as micro purchases and simplified acquisitions. Do always make sure that you have your BABA Davis-Bacon requirements flow down into the RFP, but especially in the contract. You need to make sure that all your contractors understand what their requirements are. So flowing down that language, even though it makes a contract longer, is extremely important. And I did already touch on this earlier, but really documenting how you select your contractors, taking notes when you meet, the review committee meets so that you can summarize that discussion for your PO, but you're also providing that summary, that memo to file in case of an audit. You always have to really kind of cover yourself and how you spend those EPA dollars to make sure that it's always thoroughly defensible, that it is federally compliant. And so documenting that process while you're going through the process, your head is full of it. But then, a year goes by, you might be even getting towards the end of the project. You might not recall exactly how you did that. So you want to be just really, really good about documenting, especially if, you have any staff turnover. And then lastly, I'm just going to stress that if you have in-house counsel or working with lawyers for good government to get some advice, really to limit your liability around, BABA and DBRA compliance. You also have to understand that, especially if, with BABA and DBRA, a lot of construction contractors are very familiar with prevailing wage. They are very familiar with public works requirements. So, they are actually the better ones to absorb and to better understand that risk. They're the ones who are actually performing the work. So in a way, flowing down those requirements, yes, it does protect you, but it's also fully informing them of their obligations. And I just wanted to say that Lawyers for Good Government with their pro bono attorneys, put in a huge amount of work in creating a sub-award template, which we're going to share today in our resources document. And there are specific clauses with regard to contingency, and how, that the payment of those funds to your subrecipients, to your contractors, is contingent upon the grantee being able to receive those funds from EPA. And if the contract's terminated, if they're denied payment, that they obviously are not going to be able to use that EPA funding to pay subrecipients or contractors. And then there's also some termination clauses based on available funding and on suspension of work that I think all of you as grantees will appreciate, being able to flow down some of those requirements. I think this is, everyone reads the news, everyone is well aware of what's going on with the federal government and with EPA funding. So I think everyone has to also understand the risk that they're going into in going into this work, and knowing that, there are projects that might get terminated, or there might just be temporary freezes on ASAP.